Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Birding with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And we are super excited to be hosting our first Cup Chat Showdown. So if you are joining us from inside the state of Texas, please comment with where you're joining us from in your county. If you're out of state, let us know what state you're joining from. And as always, I'm working right now to pull up Cup Chat on Facebook. So if you'll have any questions, give us a comment and we will get them answered. So today we're talking a little bit of background on our first showdown is we're talking about splitting versus lumping. And it's going to be Maureen versus Bryan. And so a little bit of background, every individual organism has a scientific name given to it by a bunch of smart people on an international committee. That's the short version. Now, but scientists, as we have learned more information, have developed new research technology, tend to argue back and forth as to if organisms should be reclassified or not. So that brings us to where we are today, splitting versus lumping. So a group of very smart professors, again, a lot of smart people on lots of committees from the American Ornithologist Union, makes decisions if organisms or bird species need to be reclassified, and either as we lump species, which means that two different species need to then become one, or if one species is really two different species, i.e. splitting that species up. So they do that and make those decisions based on lots of different information. Song dialects, DNA, plumage, behavior, the list can go on and on about the tools they use to reclassify those, make those decisions of whether to split or to lump. And so really quick, two examples. So an example of splitting would be the plain titmouse, and it has become the oak or the juniper titmouse and titmouse. Really, I don't really know on that one. Is it a titmice or titmouse, or is titmouse is singular and titmice is plural?
Yeah, just like with regular mice. Yeah.
It just sounds so weird. I don't like titmouse. I like titmice.
Okay.
So FYI, I don't like the singular titmouse. That sounds funny. I like titmice.
I mean, it's always better to have more birds. So maybe all the birders would rather have titmice than a titmouse.
Right. Titmouse sounds weird. I'm out. Anyways, okay, moving back. Now to the example of lumping. Bryan, I'm glad I've got you to chuckle this morning. I hope everybody else is laughing out there. Now back to the topic of lumping. We're going to talk about an example of that. It would be the myrtle and Audubon's warbler have now become the yellow-rumped warbler. And I did see the cutest yellow-rumped warbler yesterday out in Langtree, and he just wanted to show me his little cute little yellow rump all day. He just perfect. I could not thank him enough for being so cute. So now that we have the background information, let's start on the showdown piece. Now, just like every good presidential debate, I want y'all to keep this civil. This will not be like the 2020 presidential debate. Y'all be civil, not interrupt each other, and be kind. Okay?
Deal.
Deal. Now, as we start this showdown, I'm going to give you each an opening, unquestioned, general minute or so to share your point of view. No interrupting, remember. And so then we'll dive into the true arguments of splitting versus lumping. Do you each have an opening introduction? So Bryan, ladies first. Maureen, it's your turn.
All right, so I am going to argue for the side of splitting species. And what's important to think about is how we define the concept of a species, first off. And so one of the first times that was ever done, it was laid out as what's called the biological species concept, with the idea that two animals were the same species if they could, or if they were or potentially were interbreeding. So if they can breed and produce viable offspring, or if they could. So say they're separated by a mountain range and they're not going to come into contact with one another, but other than the mountain range, they could interbreed, then those are the same species. But to me, this gets really fuzzy when we think about that. That's a fairly old concept and is a very debated concept, but it gets pretty fuzzy when we think about, how long does something have to be separated for it to actually interbreed? And of course, the interbreeding part is important because that's how we get more, that's how we go from titmouse to titmice, right? And so that's how we get more of whatever species we have, is for them to have that ability to breed. But sometimes you even have certain populations, as we've learned more and more, we have certain populations even that are within an area, and there can be a lot of reasons that they don't interbreed. So it might not just be that that they're super different from one another in ways that we see, but it may have to do with their behaviors. It may have to do with, areas that they like to use, parts of the trees that they like to use, very small habitat differences. And I think for us I think when you lump, you kind of glaze over all of those differences and all of those little things that we might not see. So a good example, just kind of on a broader scale, is that it's been a few years now, but a few years ago, we realized that eagles and falcons are not nearly as closely related as we thought they were. And a lot of this comes in with DNA techniques, but eagles are more closely related to vultures than they are to falcons, which when you look at them doesn't necessarily make sense. But there's so much more than what meets the eye that I think for us as humans, defining what we think is similar does not necessarily fit the same thing that the birds think are similar. So I think it can be really helpful to split those up more finely to better match what is true with the birds. Just because you can't notice it when you glance at it the first time doesn't mean that they aren't really different.
Maybe I do need the flashing lights that says your time's getting long-winded.
I probably
do. To have the timer. Anyways, okay.
The sun is coming in from my window, so there's a celestial reminder going on.
Coming. Okay, so good introduction, good point of view. I have some thoughts on that one. Don't worry, Brian. It's your turn though. Before I roast Maureen.
Okay, you probably won't need a flashing light for me. I'm pretty succinct, I hope. So I am here to talk about lumping and why I generally feel more species need to be lumped together than they need to be split apart. And again, kind of like Emily was saying, over time, we've used a lot of different methods to determine what is a species, whether that's, separation geographically or their inability to interbreed, or plumage differences, song differences, all these sorts of things. But today we're seeing more and more genetic work being done. So we're kind of using those other tools of plumage, range, behavior, whatever, to kind of point us in the direction of, okay, maybe these birds maybe there's something going on there that's, maybe indicative of these are actually the same species or different species. And the more we're looking at these genetic profiles of all these different birds, the more and more we're finding that these different species, as we have them now, actually have so much DNA in common that they're truly almost identical. One example currently would be the blue-winged and the golden-winged warbler. If you don't know anything about genetics and you just look at them, they look completely different. Totally, one's solid yellow, one's mostly gray and white, different songs, different habitat preferences, but genetically, they're really the same bird. So I believe that the more and more we pour into this sort of genetic technique of looking at species, the more we're seeing that there are differences that we think are there just by looking at the birds are not really there.
Gotcha. Okay. So as that kind of kicks off, you both brought up the DNA portion. Okay. And so here's the first true question. Do you think we can solely base splitting versus lumping on a DNA test? Maureen?
So no, I don't think that we can base it just off of that. It's a very important tool that we now have, and I think we will, as we continue to make advancements in understanding just life in general, understanding what makes a bird, I think we will have other tools. There's discussion even, there's DNA, and then there's things like mitochondrial DNA. And so I think there's things we'll continue to look at and continue to understand. But I do think it's a very important tool, and something that brings up to me is that one thing that's often discussed with the splitting concept is that sometimes it means you may have kind of like you get more populations, right? And so we get more species. And so somebody may say, well, this species, there's not very many of them. If we lump those together, there's a lot of them. If we, separate them, then there's not very many of that species. And so it impacts how things might be considered like for listing. So like if it's going to be listed as threatened or endangered. And sometimes that's used very much, as a criticism of that. But I think especially in current times, as we continue to see more and more land fragmentation, it may be that we have things that are almost similar in their DNA, but there's important differences there that may affect why they're particularly adapted for a particular area, that might actually be really important for us to preserve going on in the future. So I think that DNA can, it gives us a good way to measure. But even then, there's a lot of discussion in, taxonomists. Even when you're looking at the same, DNA data, taxonomists will argue about how closely those are related.
Bryan, should we use solely DNA? Should we pick one method and use the method of DNA now that that's available to us as the sole decision making on splitting versus lumping? Which everyone should know. You studied genetics in college, right?
That is I thought of that as you brought up genetics. That's an important note.
Correct. We are right. You studied genetics in college.
I did get my degree in genetics. That was a long time.
We're listening.
It kind of scared me, just full disclosure, once I remembered that here a second ago.
You're good. It's been several years, so you're fine.
Host.
So in my opinion, genetic research is probably the strongest component as far as telling whether two species are related or not, or whether they're the same species or not. Because really, truthfully, when it comes down to it, it has the least, the genetic argument has sort of the least leeway and sort of like a gray area as far as the data goes. It just kind of, there's a percentage of this is how much you match with this other species. And we can sort of, I don't know that there necessarily is a line right now that says, if there's this much, then you are a species. If there's this much, you're not. But it sort of gives us that, really straight clarity. This is really, it's just a numbers game at that point, versus everything else is kind of, a little bit wishy-washy. Yes, they can form hybrids, but are they viable after how many generations? So that's sort of my opinion, is that it is the strongest argument for determining two species. But like Maureen said, I do agree that we should incorporate other aspects when we're looking at this. And like I said before, we can kind of use those other characteristics to determine where we want to look next for determining whether two birds are different species or not. And as far as listing goes, as far as what Maureen said about, if you lump two species and one of them is endangered and one of them is not, then you have a much larger population, and that population that was considered endangered before may not be considered endangered anymore. But what I would argue is that those populations, if they're genetically the same as the others and they should be lumped together into the same species, we can still have those protections on the smaller population with subspecies, right? So we see that today with least terns. Interior least terns are a listed subspecies, while least terns in general are not. Rufo red knots, and several other cases. So we have still protections on those small limited populations, while the overall population can be pretty healthy.
You bring up a good point, Bryan. Let's talk subspecies. Is the key to splitting versus lumping and ending debate to subspecies, to have subspecies of a species? Is that the key? Does that end the debate if we lump and then have subspecies? Maureen?
So I think with subspecies, this is definitely very much at the heart of the debate. So I have actually right now, this is different, a little bit different than birds, but I have two different snake ID books sitting on my desk, and one of them has subspecies and the other doesn't. And this is why also, kind of as a side note, and you know, somebody that fields a lot of questions about wildlife in Texas, you know, and somebody will ask me like, well, how many species of snakes are in Texas? You know, how many species of birds are in Texas? Birds are a little different because they move around more, but even something like snakes, that for the most part, like they can't, and they don't just show up way outside their range like birds do. It's challenging because are you defining it as a species or a subspecies? And so there's definite implications there. So as Bryan mentioned, you can still have, you know, protections for a subspecies, but you still have to decide when is it a species and when is it a subspecies. So for example, one of the things we talk about that we are super excited whenever we see it here in Val Verde County is when we have hybrid parulas, right? There's tropical parulas.
Wait,
there's
wait,
northern
that's a
parulas.
whole other question.
But it has to do with the
It's
subspecies.
not allowed in this question. You cannot bring up hybrids yet.
Oh, well, that's part of the subspecies. Okay, pause. So there's that, which apparently we're going to talk about.
Well, because are hybrids
Then-
considered?
Okay.
You
so,
can't go there yet because if it's a hybrid, it interbreeds, and
Okay.
therefore then it's a species. So you can't
So-
even bring up the hybrid yet, Miss Splitter up or
Okay.
Lumper up there. I'm not sure.
Then this is where it gets confusing, is because you can have things like parulas, which I shall not give any other details on, and then you have yellow-rumped warblers, which also can interbreed, and they're, again, as Bryan mentioned, they're a single species, and then we talk about the subspecies of myrtles, audubons, and myrtles, audubons. I completely mixed those up.
And Audubon.
Myrtles and audubons, yellow-rumped warblers. And so those are considered the same species, but I really think they should be considered separate species. Again, you know, as Bryan mentioned with the different warblers, that there can be some that they look completely different. Their genetics are very similar. That's where I would say that it's important to not just look at genetics, because when there are those very obvious visual differences, just because it doesn't mean anything now, doesn't mean that it won't mean anything in the future. And just because it doesn't mean anything, like just because we see the DNA as a certain way, doesn't mean that it won't affect how those birds interact. So like birds are very visual species, and there's a good chance that when those different colors are occurring, there's a reason that they may choose, you know, one instead of another. So, you know, I've lived in Texas now for quite a while, even though I'm originally from Colorado. Obviously, like as a human, I could interbreed with anybody in Colorado genetically, but the behaviors are different, right? I mean, I'm married, so this is a very, very hypothetical situation. But the behaviors of somebody from a very different place or a very different culture may keep me from doing that. And so same thing from the bird's perspective, is that question of like, where do we decide to draw that line? Just because their DNA looks the same doesn't mean that they actually want to have anything to do with each other. And so I think that kind of just to tie it back to the species versus subspecies, you know, where do we decide to draw that line is still an argument. Even if we can designate things as subspecies, it's, well, why are tropical parulas a different species from northern parulas, but yellow-rumped warblers are all lumped into one?
Yeah, so there would be no lumping. If we had to go to subspecies, there would be no splitting. It'd be all lumping, and then you would split into subspecies.
But you still have to decide at what point do those happen? So
we just go back to the original list of the smart guy sitting in the room. Come on now, Maureen, this is simple. All right, well, Ryan, are subspecies the key to ending this debate? And remember, you can't talk about hybrids yet.
Okay, not to worry. I don't think that. I think you're just looking at the same question on a different level, right? So,
That may be true.
I don't think that it's really going to end the debate. It just kind of adds another like meta level to the debate, because then you're saying, because within a species, let's say dark-eyed juncos or whatever, and you have all these different subspecies of the same species, even within that, you can say, what are we using to determine what is a subspecies and how many subspecies should we have? And you're looking at the same sort of things that you'd be looking at for species, right?
Well,
So
yeah, somebody in some smart guys in the room would have to set some black and white parameters.
Right. And that would be the end of the debate.
Yes.
Somebody could say, this is what defines a species, this is what we use, then it would all be over and all taxonomy would make sense, but we're not there yet.
And just for our listeners to understand that those smart people in the room are having this exact argument of this, of whether to split or lump and where you make those decisions. And it's actually called the species problem. Like that is a statement that they use because this is ongoing since the 1800s when we first talked about species like at all. Is there a solution? This would be like a whole other debate. I'm not getting in on this debate, but can we solve the species problem? Is it possible, and should we try to have a black and white answer? Or there are people that very much feel that this back and forth is more important than having an answer to the species problem.
It depends on what kind of person you are. I'm a black and white kind of person. We need some black and white lines, not gray areas and deciding, and here's my 2 cents on the whole debate. Are y'all ready? Pick something and leave it. Because as a beginner birder, it's very challenging so we're out birding. Bryan and I stumble on a bunch of yellow-rumped warblers the last time we were out. And we're sitting there looking at it. And this one looks different from this one. Oh, but that one's still a yellow-rumped. Well, who decided that? It looks totally different. And so then you're sitting there and you're looking. And as a beginner birder, you're like, well, that wasn't what you said a yellow-rumped warbler looked like a second ago. And unless the little guy turns around and shows me his little yellow rump, sometimes that can get a little tricky for the beginners. And just have some black and white answers. And then everybody will know the answer and we can quit arguing about it. Anyways, so let's then go back and I'll let us start talking about hybrids, because hybrids are something that definitely, I would virtually say, complicate the issue. Because, yes, they definitely complicate the issue. And from a livestock perspective, because I'm going to go there, when we have different species, it's truly defined by they cannot interbreed. I guess you now have ligers and tigers and all that, but that they don't interbreed. Oh my gosh, ligers and tigers, they're going to have to reclassify those.
Well, but ligers are not, they have to produce viable offspring.
Ligers are not ligers. I haven't done much research into ligers. So
yeah, ligers can't have babies.
So in the livestock world, we talk about strictly species cannot, if they can't interbreed, that's good. Like sheep and goats, completely separate, cannot make babies. But we have different breeds of sheep and goats. So we kind of do that subspecies, but we call them different breeds because they can interbreed. They can make different looking things like a hybrid. But breeds have very specific characteristics and specific traits that are uniform to that breed. Now, as livestock world, we have completely muddled all of that up, and the breed, and surely the birds don't muddle it up near as much as we do as humans involving ourselves. So, but hybrids, because two species can interbreed, the argument is one, should they be as one species because they can interbreed and produce viable offspring? And then second, what are the hybrids?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good, I think it's a good point. And I think I really think you have to discuss the subspecies concept and the hybrids. I do think it all goes together, which is why I brought up the pluralists. But I think there's, can they interbreed? And I think there's, do they interbreed? And so this is where I very much realize that it is very frustrating for a beginner to be like, man, these things keep changing. But we learn more, for one, and two, our world keeps changing. And so there's things that may have had opportunities to interbreed in the past that don't anymore. And there's a current study, actually, I think it's on dark-eyed juncos in California, that it's not even appearance differences so much as there's some that migrate and some that don't. And so right now, they could all still interbreed, but do they? Are the migratory ones and the resident ones that look similar and live right next to each other, are they actually interbreeding? And we're kind of seeing that. It's kind of a fun, it's something fun to watch like in real time that's happening right now. So when we think about the Perulas, for instance, so here in Val Verde County is one of the very few places ever,
Very small dot
on the map that you can find that hybrid. So yes,
Hold on,
they
wait.
can.
And that's why you should come to bring the
And that's why you should come.
Because we are the small dot on the map where they can interbreed, and we have hybrid Perulas.
Right.
Okay, ready.
So
go.
they can interbreed, but they typically, throughout most of the ranges of both of those birds, they're not overlapping, and they don't. Yellow-rumped warblers have more areas where they can hybridize, but it's still, to me, a question of how frequently is that happening. And you've got this huge chunk of the population that is going to be just myrtles, and you've got this huge chunk that's going to be just audubons, and they can interbreed, but how often is that happening? Yellow rumps are, more of an argument as far as, again, with a bigger range. But I think that's an important designation, is not just can they interbreed, but do they interbreed? Are we making those hybrids? And so when we talk about like the subspecies concept, say you're talking about that with if you wanted to argue that the Perulas should be lumped because they can interbreed and produce a hybrid, then do you have a northern, a tropical, and a Del Rio? Because there's that hybrid of subspecies. And then you have the argument too of what degree of hybridization would make that count as a subspecies. Do you have to have mom one and dad the other? What if you're 25% northern? What if you're 12.5% northern? At what point does that happen? And so I think it's just better to say these hybrids occur, and they are a mix of these two different species that sometimes we get. So you've got myrtles warblers and audubon's warblers, and sometimes we get this hybrid of these two different species.
Gotcha. So you would keep all of them separate.
All of them separate.
And hybrids would just be hybrids.
Yep.
Okay, Bryan, what do we do with the hybrids?
Okay, so that's kind of a complicated question. Again, it kind of comes down to where you draw the line, right? So
some lines in this deal.
So we have things like ducks, for instance, right? So you have something that looks like a hooded merganser with this long pointy bill, totally different than a common goldeneye. But hybrids do occur, just very rarely, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in other populations of birds, like our two Perulas in the Del Rio area, all it takes for them to hybridize is that overlap in range. And where that occurs, they hybridize readily and often, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of, for me, depends on how often that's occurring, and not necessarily how much overlap there is, but where there is overlap, how often is that hybridization occurring within that overlap zone? So if it's happening just like boom, boom, boom all the time, then in my mind, that kind of leads me to believe that the only thing separating these two birds is geography, right?
Yeah.
And so when it comes down to, so say we lumped the Perulas into Perula, and we had this sort of tropical subspecies and northern subspecies, then what would happen is in that sort of overlap zone, technically we wouldn't call it a hybrid anymore, we would call it an intergrade, right? Because they're within two subspecies of the same species.
Right.
So in my opinion, it's kind of still just a matter of where you draw that line in the sand as far as how much hybridization is too much, and then how much are the hybrids reproducing or backcrossing, or are they only reproducing with themselves? And then in some cases, it's really rare, but you have these hybrid swarms that go off and then form their own species from the hybrid. So, sometimes that's like a mode of speciation of certain animals. So it's kind of complicated. I don't think it really helps us necessarily. Again, it's sort of like where you draw that line and how narrowed down you're looking at it.
So you don't think we're going to solve this issue on Cup Chat today?
I don't think the American Ornithological Society is going to come watch me and Bryan and be like, "Hey, now we got to figure it out."
You did it.
We have 6 people watching live right now. Maybe it's like 6 smart guys on the committee.
Maybe.
Anyways, so we are nearing our 30-minute time slot. So final thoughts. Here's your opportunity to say anything else you want. And I will let you now interrupt if you feel like you need to interrupt and make a point. But we are going to limit this to a few minutes. So Maureen, final thoughts.
So I think my overall final thought, even more so than lumping and splitting, is that we are in a world that is constantly changing. And so as much as it can be frustrating to have things go one way or another, not only are our tools developing, but we also have situations that are developing. And Bryan brought up something that I wish I could go into more about, bottleneck effects and speciation, these events where you have something like a hybrid go off and make their own species. And all of that adds up to a lot of complication, and it's important that we continue to do the best we can, in defining. I don't think we can solve the species problem. I think it's best that we keep working on defining what we have, and that when you have things that are different, we have to be open to the idea that what birds consider to be different is not the same necessarily as what we consider to be different. You can't always see that in the DNA. You can't always see that in where they occur. And it's important that we kind of, go as much as possible off of what birds define as a species, which I think overall will lead to more splitting.
Well, I will discuss that with the birds, Maureen. Love you, but here's my roast on that one. It would be super simple if the birds would just tell us that guy is not like me, and he is from a different country, and he is not what I am. It'd be easy.
Would be easier.
Your method would be perfect if it would work. Anyway, sorry. There's my roast on you today, Bryan. Just keep that in mind.
I would say that's exactly sort of part of the problem, is that we don't know what's going on with these birds because we can't talk to them, right? So there's even birds where, how do we even know that? How does two Altamira orioles know which one's the male, which one's the female? To us, they look identical, and we don't even know how they're telling the sexes apart. The birds know more than we do, right? So in the end, they don't really care what we call them. They're just going to do their thing, and nature's going to be nature. And in the end, it's like, we're just kind of making stuff up. But what I would say, to a point that you had made earlier, Emily, for any of our listeners who are beginner birders, I would just encourage you to not too bogged down in any of this. Because if you're just out trying to enjoy birds and you're just new to birding, or you just know that you love birds, just know that if this doesn't interest you, it doesn't have to. Like, it doesn't really matter to you, right? So
well, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you are going to see a bird, and you can call it whatever you want. Heck, you could make up your own name for every bird there is, and you could still be a very accomplished birder.
Although something we didn't touch on really that is important is listing, right? So like Bryan has a competition with somebody in Kenny County as to who has seen the most birds in that county. If they split some of these, one of them could get ahead. And so then that's another point of debate sometimes amongst people is, if I've seen the most birds in the county, and then all of a sudden somebody, far off in this smart conference room decides that things are going to be split, and then somebody gets ahead of me just because they changed the taxonomy, that kind of ticks me off.
Well,
so it does matter.
Yes, it could matter.
It doesn't matter when you are learning how to bird if this does not interest you and you do not care. But I do think some of our more advanced listeners might take offense if we say it doesn't matter.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying you could. To appreciate nature, you do not have to keep a list. You do not have to know their names. You could personally name every bird you see, and everybody would be fine. Yes. I still call the painted bunting a painted bunny because, it would be such a cuter name. Who doesn't love a bunny that's colorful? Come on.
This is a whole different class of animals from a bird.
integrated
really
species. We're lumping the bunny.
I am definitely, I think even Brian might argue with me to split bunnies and birds.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, you might convert me on that one.
Yeah. All right. Well, Brian, okay. Sorry, we interrupted your final thoughts a little bit. So wrap up your final thought. Or
I mean, I guess I don't really have too much else to add. But in my mind, I feel like even if we don't sort of draw a line or make things black and white, the more that we can find consistency in our taxonomy, especially with birds, the better off we will be. So in my mind, the things that frustrate me as a birder in my own sort of way are cases where we have sort of, like I mentioned, the golden winged and blue winged warbler that have like extensive hybridization and back crosses, and it's been going on for years, and the more time goes on, the more hybrids we get. And we call those two different species, but at the same time we have, you know, yellow-rumped warblers that are lumped into one species that have this hybrid zone or integrate zone that's been there forever. I just, if we can just like make it consistent, that would be great. And I think that would add a lot of clarity for our beginner birders as well. If we could say, this is what we're doing, this is why.
I agree. Consistency would be key, because it is definitely confusing, because some are one way and some are the other. Whether that line is black, well, and that kind of gets to having a line, Brian. I hate to tell you that. There's your roast. Yours was not near as bad as Maureen's, but there's your, you know, having consistency would be to have a set of guidelines or kind of policies we follow, and therefore giving a line, even if it's kind of dotted or gray or dashed, to have some sort of consistency. But you're right. Why is in this one case this is completely okay, in this case it's not? It's like a kid in high school. Well, that kid did the same thing I did, and I went to the principal's office. Well, you just didn't get caught yet. So anyways, I think that we have I have had fun on our first showdown. Did y'all have fun?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. This was good. Okay, so so let us know if you are a splitter versus a lumper, what your opinion is. Comment on the post afterwards. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, especially if I would love to read some roast on Maureen and Brian's comments, because that's extra fun.
And another note too, always feel free to make comments, and you can either send them to a message or put it on a Facebook post. We have pretty thick skin, but if you're like, wow guys, this was way too scientific, this is not what I look for in a cup chat, let us know. And if you're like, hey, that was kind of interesting because it doesn't super affect my life, but I like to see what other people are arguing about when I can be disconnected from it, then let us know that too if you have any thoughts on that. So
up next, cup chat, arguing me and Maureen about crested caracaras. Just kidding. Just kidding. We would never do that to any of you.
If that happened.
We would never ever publicly debate crested caracaras on the podcast. Don't worry. Okay, so I have a fun thing. So Maureen shared on Facebook a post of a mice stuck on a twig, and we told you we would do a giveaway. And so we're going to do the giveaway now. So Brian, give me a number between 1 and 26.
Ooh.
25.
Oh, good Lord. Good job.
You want to make you work for it.
Yeah. 1, 2.
Build the suspense.
7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, so our winner is Tara DeBro, and she will be getting I will be sending you a private message over Instagram, and she will be winning a Birding with Extension goodie bag. Here's my few little reminders before we have got to get off today, because I have arrived very far this morning. Is that Birding the Border registration is open. We are still planning on hosting a very safe and very fun and very exciting Birding the Border coming up in April. So get registered. We're so excited for that. We will be coming out with a save the date graphic soon on our social media pages for all of our programs. Learn to Bird, Rio Diablo Birding Camp, which registration is now open for all you youth advanced birders. Learn to Birds, and maybe some other new special programs that we've got in the works for this fall. So anyways, Maureen, Bryan, any final thoughts this morning as we end our first showdown? This was fun.
It was fun. It was fun. I'm excited for future ones. And
you were all worried we were gonna all hate each other at the end.
I wasn't worried. It took me a while when you first mentioned this concept to warm up to it and figure out what we were gonna do. But I think
it worked out good, right?
Yeah.
Except for you thinking we could talk to birds.
Let's talk about science and giving me enough funding to answer these questions later.
We will do it. Well, everyone, y'all have a great week. Happy Wednesday, and we will see y'all next week for Cup Chat. Maureen, who is our guest next week?
Actually, to be determined exactly who it will be, but next week we're going to have some birding buddies on. So if you enjoyed listening to our guides and getting to meet them, really just as important in every group that goes out is the birding buddies who are going with those guides. And so we are going to be hosting 2 of our birding buddies to talk more about their experience. They are very local. So as far as like your local knowledge of birds and species, our birding buddies are super, super important to us, super valuable to us. So stay tuned for exactly the names to be revealed. So
well, bye. I do want to say thanks, Beth. We did just see your comment that you registered, and I'm glad you got your postcard. So bye, everybody. Have a wonderful week.